Hi, it's Rory from counsellingtutor.com and I'm with Bob Cooke from Manchester Institute for Psychotherapy in my hometown.
Hello.
And today we're going to talk about projective identification, Bob.
Correct.
So, what is projective identification?
Interesting question. Now, projective identification is a psychoanalytical term.
Okay.
In other words, it goes back to the birth of psychoanalysis, which of course was Freud.
Yes, Sigmund Freud.
Yeah. And he started to use that term way back in time. And it is also part of the transference phenomena. Okay. So if we look at the mechanism of transference, you've got projection.
Yes. So
the person projects out onto you. That's the object. Okay?
Yeah.
And then you've got counter-transference, which, if the person hasn't actually sorted their stuff out, that's the therapist,
yes,
may well transfer back onto the client some of their unresolved processes.
Okay, so that sounds to me like you may be working with a client who reminds you, say, of their father, and what you do is that you see them as your father.
Yeah.
They project that,
Yeah.
You pick that up like a radio antenna,
Yeah.
and then you start reacting to the client. That's
Correct.
the counter-transference, as if
Yeah.
they were your father. So,
Correct.
depending on the relationship you had with your father,
Correct.
you will be responding to, at some level, your father's persona, not a client.
That's right. So a client comes into the room and says to the therapist, you know, when you look at me like that, you remind me just when I was a 3-year-old talking to my father, and he raised his eyebrows in disapproval.
Yes.
Just the same way.
Yes.
As you do.
And there we see a beautiful example of transference and counter-transference just played out in that.
Yeah.
The raising of the eyebrows and
Yeah.
how it affects the client.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that's the enactment. Now, of course, the real truth is that might have been the therapist raising their eyebrows in positivity.
Yes.
However, the enactment is a time in history.
Yes. So we're moving back from here and now material, and we're transforming ourselves like we're in a time machine back into the client's
Correct.
past.
Correct.
Yes. And they're responding to the past.
Correct.
Not the here and now. So that's a kind of an interesting starting point, isn't
Yeah,
it?
so projection is the mechanism of how the client transfers onto the object, i.e. the therapist. So that's the first part of transference projection. Second part, as I said, is the reaction back again, which is often called counter-transference.
Yes.
Okay, so let's take projective identification. Okay, another part of transference. Okay, so we've got the idea of projecting.
Yes.
Right, okay. So projective identification is a form of counter-transference. I'll explain this a little bit more now. So you project onto the object, i.e. the therapist.
Yes.
The therapist identifies with the projection.
Yes.
Yeah, and if it's unresolved unconscious processes by the therapist,
Yes.
they will enact back in response to the projection. So they identify with the projection and then they enact out.
Okay.
So it's a form of counter-transference.
Okay. And it feels like a form of theatre as well. Say, for instance,
yeah.
you had a female client working with a male therapist, and the female client, and this does sometimes happen, it happens the other way. It happens the other way. You might have a female therapist and a male client, but the female client starts to flirt with the male therapist.
Okay.
The male therapist has got unresolved issues around how he feels about romantic engagements with women,
for example,
and therefore he reacts from a place that isn't healthy. So in real terms, he may flirt back, and he may kind of possibly cross the threshold.
Yeah, and of course is particularly unhealthy for the client, and usually a past enactment of the client's history.
Yes.
Let me give you another example of projective identification. But before I do, let's just say one thing. Okay, let's look at projection again.
Okay.
Right. Clients will project usually feelings they don't want onto the other. So, for example, someone who's depressed doesn't want the feelings of worthlessness, of unvaluableness, anger maybe, passivity, futility, whatever those feelings are. They don't want to internally keep them. So through the mechanism of projection, we'll project those unwanted bad feelings onto the therapist. So the therapist, hopefully, especially if they've worked out their own processes, will act as a container, for those bad feelings.
Yes.
And therefore, and from that, the therapist stays an adult and will help work through that process. Okay. Now, let's take that same scenario again. Client comes in depressed, projects out the feelings they don't want onto the object, i.e. the therapist.
Yes.
Now, the therapist, for example, may have a depressed part of themselves, right? They identify with the depression feelings of the client, so you've got projective identification. Then unconsciously, they act out in some way. So, for example, if they don't want to feel the feelings that has been projected onto them because it identifies with their own depression, futility, worthlessness, etc., they may act out in a way to intellectualize the depression with the client. So actually what doesn't happen, the therapist doesn't go towards the feelings which the client needs to go to. They're diverted away into an intellectual process about depression instead of going where they need to go to, because the therapist doesn't want to deal with their own feelings of depression.
And this comes down to the old saying that I sometimes talk to my training group about, is a client can only go as far as the therapist is willing to go themselves.
That's right.
If there's anything unresolved for the therapist,
correct,
this is territory where they can't access the feelings, so they'll try and think their way out of it.
In this example, yes.
Yes.
Absolutely. And of course it can happen around thinking in reverse. Now, projective identification is usually a very primal process. So the feelings which the client doesn't want at an unconscious level gets projected out, right, in quite a strong way. The identification by the therapist again, and then they act out at a quite a real primal level here. So we're talking about really strong counter-transference processes.
Okay, so in practice terms, if we were to observe that, if we were a fly on the wall in the therapy room, how would that look like? How would the client, first of all, act out? What would that look like?
The client?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's take the depression again.
Yes, okay.
Someone who comes in depressed, they will act out often very flat, monotone voice.
Yes.
Talking in quite bland syllables.
Sure.
Talking about matter-of-fact issues. What they do is keep away from the feelings of futility, hopelessness, perhaps turned inward anger.
Yes.
They keep away from those feelings, and they talk about the depression's come on again, or I don't know what to do, or very reactive processes instead of proactive processes. What they don't do is talk about those feelings particularly, and certainly not to take responsibility of those feelings, to work them through. What they tend to do instead is project them out onto the therapist, so they don't have to deal with the feelings of futility. So you're not going to see a cathartic expression of feelings with someone who's depressed.
Sure. So in other words, you're not going to get people who are coming to kind of when I think of catharsis, I think of almost a transformation, a release of negative energy, and almost like putting this very heavy bag down and going,
that's right.
in a kind of visual way.
And instead of the therapist then helping the person take ownership or responsibility of those negative feelings, the therapist in some way goes to another zone, whether it's talking about thinking or talking about behaviour, Well, in fact, talking about something else in an intellectual way, anything but looking at the feelings which have been identified, usually about the therapist's own depression.
So it usually ends up, if I'm hearing this correctly, in a bit of an intellectual dialogue.
Often, yeah.
Where the therapist is desperately trying to avoid their own historic material.
Yeah.
And as such is not connected at any level with the client.
That's right. Now you may get a situation where the therapist identifies with the projection, right? But because they've been dealing with it themselves, they understand it at some level.
Mm-hmm.
Or they go, gosh, how come I'm feeling this all of a sudden? Yeah. And they are able then perhaps to hold it because they know where it's come from. And they don't act it out.
Right.
But it's the acted out projective identification which becomes the most problematic.
So is there something around projective identification, that process for the therapist of being subconscious, and the secret of the success is bringing it into here and now awareness?
Correct. And working it through.
Yes, and that of course is therapy.
That'd be a co-created relationship.
Sure.
Where both parties can work through the co-created content at that time, which has been evoked, of course, from the client's past, or even in some cases the therapist's past, which hopefully they've worked through in therapy themselves.
Which is why it is such a good idea for students to have their own therapy.
And, and supervision.
And supervision.
Yeah.
Well, supervision is essential. To work that through. And sometimes, Bob, my students will say to me, "Do I really have to have therapy?" I don't know if you have this. I think everybody ever gets.
Yeah, all the time.
But there's nothing wrong with me, and I say to them, it's not about what's wrong with you. This is an opportunity for you to reflect on how you are in the world, and maybe just pick up on stuff that you're unaware of, to bring it into awareness, and then once you've got it into awareness, to ask that question, Bob: how does this affect my practice?
Absolutely. And when people say things like, well, there's nothing wrong with me, my heart often sinks. Because for a therapist to be saying that, in some ways, it's a fairly naive statement, because it's not so much about what is wrong with them, what they know, what may or may not be wrong with them, what's happening to their unconscious level.
Yes.
It's an exploration of the unconscious, unaware parts of the self. That's the important part here.
Yes. I agree, and I rephrase it in this way. I say, have some personal development, external personal development. I do think there is sometimes a little idea, maybe a little fantasy idea that goes through students, that they think, I wonder if Rory thinks I'm not quite right. I wonder if he's seeing something that I don't know about. And I say, it's not about me analysing you. This is about you going and having an extended reflection with someone who can sit with you and kind of just think about how you are in the world.
You see, it would be odd, wouldn't it? It really would be extraordinarily odd that if a therapist wasn't touched, moved, had some sort of identification with many of the existential issues the clients bring.
Yes.
That would be odd.
Yes.
Just on a human level.
Yes. I mean, it's synchronous. You should say this. I'm here today. I have been earlier on doing a bereavement course.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I've come to awareness is kind of my history of bereavement and how I am in the world with that.
Yeah.
And some of the material has touched me today, and I'll take that away and I'll think, well, if it's touched me and it's in my awareness, how is that going to be when clients bring up the material?
And a client walks into my Rory and says, do you know what I want to do with it today? It's my feelings of loss in life.
Yes.
And you've just been talking about what you just said
Absolutely.
on the training course the day before, and your own history being evoked. That often is the synchronicity of therapy.
Yes.
The clients walk in the next day with the very things that have been evoked with you or you've been thinking
Yes.
about the previous week.
Absolutely, and that's happened to me countless times when I've either done courses or whether I've had my own personal therapy. I've come along and I've thought, oh, I was talking about that the other day.
So common.
It is, isn't it?
Happens all the time.
It does, and maybe we're heightened to that because of the material. It just kind of connects to us, or maybe that by taking our own personal development seriously, that we're more able to understand ourselves a little better.
That's right. So the therapeutic implications of projective identification are so important to think about, because the biggest implication, of course, is that through the projections of the client and the unconscious identifications of the therapist, real therapy may never happen. All that usually would happen in that case would be an enactment of the client's or the therapist's history.
Yes. Yeah, and in fact, without saying too much, I was in a training group the other day, and that came up. It shone like a beacon in the room, where one of my trainees was saying, I just wish this client had get on with it. They were just like me in the past. I'm very honest and very in case discussion, bringing material. And what came of that was maybe a realisation of an ownership by the trainee of, I really need to access my own therapy and look at this in more detail. And that's just a wonderful thing, and has to be congratulated. I think I've learned again so much, Bob, in this short interview, and I hope for the people out there, for those of you who watch, that is really, really interesting. And if there's one thing that I'd say at the end of this, is it's so important that we gain an understanding of ourselves. That's why we have process groups, sometimes known as personal development groups, and that is why we have our own therapy.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't echo that more. And my final plea is that when we're talking about these things, we're talking about very subtle unconscious processes, and therefore we need our own therapy and our own supervision to help us in terms of working through some of these things, so that we don't in an unwittingly way enact out the processes that the client brings, because otherwise not much therapy really happens.
No, it becomes more of a chat. And
worse than that, of course, it can reinforce some early life decisions of the client in a way where they don't empower themselves. They simply reinforce those negative parts of themselves. So it's a really important processes we're talking about.
And it's a double bind, because it reinforces those negative aspects of themselves while they're in therapy.
Yeah.
So it's not bad. Well, Bob Cooke, that is a wonderful exploration. Thank you so much for explaining that and taking the time to do that. And as always, to the people who watch, thank you for watching. Thank you.
Bye-bye.